Okay, okay. I've just opened. I've got your material here.
And if you order them by file name, they should be in numerical order. That will make sense.
Yeah.
And I think they'll all play in preview actually, so you might be able to just preview can switch up the order of things sometimes annoyingly, but maybe have a look and see whether it works. Or
Okay, let me just see. Hold on. Let me just close this one. Your preview doesn't like your MP4 files, but that's fine. So we'll do the stills, as it were, and then we'll have to shift.
okay.
As we come to... The first few are JPEGs, right?
The first, I think, 4 JPEGs, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Can you see what...
Yeah, I can now, yeah.
Okay. So, over to you, Mike.
Hang on, anyone going to be a note taker for infrastructure?
Yeah, I'll do it.
Brilliant.
The other thing we're doing, Mike, which, I mean, this glossary idea we talked about the other day, has now got 2 iterations. So one is, which is why I asked you to invent a name or title for your contribution, so that becomes an entry in itself. But so far through today, people have also taken notes of conversations to pick up terms, almost like to sift through terms or concepts that keep coming back, which, you know, are a secondary layer of this glossary around the conversation. So I think John is now taking notes. But we'll try and pull that together later on in the afternoon. Okay?
Yeah. Okay.
Great, thanks.
Cool, thank you. I hope this works. It's not the image that I wanted to start with. Originally, what I was looking for, and I don't have here, can everyone hear me?
Yep, sounds good.
That's okay. Were a series of late Charles Schulz cartoons, late 60s, early Peanuts cartoons, where he uses, I think for a week, he uses the same images and just alters the text as a way of kind of starting to talk about certain conventions which are in both comic strips and in later cartoons and other forms of animation, which I think are the points at which kind of interest me. And coming from a sort of kind of instructional basis of trying to just sort of throw some research material into a wider conversation. So I think this and the next 4 images are all taken from The Angriest Dog in the World, which is the cartoon strip that David Lynch published sort of really sporadically over a period of about 9 years from, I think, the early 80s to the early 90s, about 83 to 92. They all have the same images and just the voice text, kind of voice bubbles changed. So you can maybe cycle through those, Edgar, and you'll get to one where, so you'll see that the format is always the same. It's always the dog on his leash, he never moves, and at some point the sun goes down for the final frame. But by the time you get to the last one, which is a late one, the format starts to change slightly, in that it kind of doubles down on the kind of structural performance of how the comic strip is built by starting to erode the frame as well as having this kind of repeated iteration. And I think what interests me predominantly in cartoons and the history of cartooning is this kind of sort of consistent focus on its formal structure and this kind of profound interest in the possibilities of kind of multiple iterations within a sort of limited context. Okay, next slide. I think that's it's a clip actually.
Okay, hold on. This is now. We can do it. It's just a bit more messy than one would hope it would be. So this is the various shapes. Is that the one?
Yep.
Let's drop that into VLC. needs to be bigger. We need that full.
Okay, if we could jump back to the, it's going to be like the fifth slide, I think. There are two truck slides.
So this one's Toy Story. Is that the one you want?
No, before that.
There we go.
So yeah, there are two, one of Roadrunner, one of YEE. So the kind of, it's actually slightly out of sequence, but anyway. The two things, as well as this kind of iteration structure, what interests me about these kind of early cartoons is that it kind of compounds out in the sort of formal logic of the thing. And so what that last clip and these two images, what I really wanted to show was an image of the background sort of scrolls, which are used to make repeating backgrounds when characters are in motion. So kind of used all the time in something like Roadrunner, where you have a sort of a desert landscape that kind of loops, and they're made from sort of 2 meter long, 30 centimeter high paintings, generally. The ones, I've seen quite a few, and generally that's what they are. And then there's kind of beautiful scrolls that just have this kind of repeated background, and you know that it's a repeated background. The same things go past, you register it automatically in the same way that in that Tom and Jerry sequence, there's a little bit of that in the background as Tom and Jerry run past. So as well as that, it also that kind of pulls into question this kind of the sort of ontological complexity that's possible also. The other kind of way that the cartoons, as well as sort of constantly being public about the mode of production, is that they also use the kind of limitations to advantage, and they kind of play with the ontologies. So the way that Tom changes shape, for instance, or if we can go to the next slide, which is the one from Toy Story. Just a much later example, but it's kind of a favourite, where in Toy Story 3, there's this kind of on-running gag about sort of parts and wholes and what constitutes Mr. Potato Head and what doesn't. Sometimes the potato is missing, sometimes it's pieces and parts and they're remotely related. Sometimes at this kind of late point they get together as a group and they try and find a body, and the best they can do is a tortilla. And it kind of causes this kind of problem story. But this is Mr. Potato Head as a tortilla. But they kind of use his eyes separated from his body as kind of people and things. So it kind of really kind of draws out this ontological flexibility, which is possible in cartoons, but always through a sort of a methodology that relates to the mode of the cartoon's production itself. And then there are these three clips from, again, all from Roadrunner. I'm a bit of a Chuck Jones fan, so the early part of this has quite a few Chuck Jones.
Let me just see whether I can get them all into VLC now. Is that the right one?
Yeah, just play them in number order, it's fine. Yeah, it's a bit of a glitch, it's fine.
Okay.
Okay, next slide. There should be 2 of Daffy Duck.
There's 4 of Daffy Duck actually. What's all 4?
We'll start with the green ones first. Yeah?
Okay, hold on.
Yeah, we will go through all 4 of them. Okay, so the other, another kind of factor in all this is and as part of this kind of revelation of its formal structure, obviously what's notable about Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote cartoons is it's constantly breaking the 4th wall. Something that was resisted by cinema, for instance, up to a far later date, was part of the kind of original structure of cartoons. Kind of most famously when you get to something like, so these are all stills from Duck Amuck. It's a Chuck Jones Daffy Duck cartoon from 1953. Whereas the kind of most meta version of this, where it really starts to play with the structure, but I guess the introduction to this is really how much the empathy that one builds with the coyote in Roadrunner is both an empathy with failure, but it's an empathy with the kind of practical conceits that he's putting together. So you're always aware of exactly how he's planned to do something, and so one's empathy is built up around the inevitable failure of this, and an awareness of the kind of media and materials that he's playing with. Duck Amuck, and we can kind of cycle through these images, kind of starts introducing some of the other kind of structural conceits, which is sort of there and not there in Duck Amuck. So it begins with a film. A slipping of the registration gate of the projector, which is this kind of black line, and so he's talking to the 2 parts of his body as they're split. It allows for the ontological possibility of him then being in 2, and there being 2 versions of Daffy Duck, which Daffy being kind of generally obstreperous, he takes immediate dislike to his identical self. And then it kind of proceeds to these kind of direct humiliations that are kind of imposed upon him by the animator, the unseen animator, where you see his tools. He's unseen up until the end, and it kind of provides the final punchline who the animator is. But it's a more kind of elaborate version of what's happening all the time in the cartoons that I enjoy, where the kind of porosity of the structure is constantly present and kind of iterated. And next slide should be Harryhausen. Okay.
But this one's 1 million years BC, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Okay, so the leap that's being made here is from cell animation to stop motion animation, and there's potential of showing kind of any number of Harryhausen clips, which I think most people know. The interesting point, I think, for me comes is when humans start entering the frame and you have this kind of interaction, whereby there's this kind of, I think, for how I read them, and I think that they were always kind of legible as kind of technical feats, whereby the sort of human artifact nature of the models that are being manipulated is always somehow present, and always kind of legible in the image. And it becomes particularly kind of strongly articulated when humans are then matted into the shots. Okay, which is a way of getting to also the next one. So, and I think what is going to be kind of a key sort of reiteration of this is the difference between technologies like cartoons and stop motion animation and digital animation, which I think does a completely different thing. Though it is belatedly trying to claw back some of the empathy that's constructed through this kind of ever-present fabrication. And if we can we show the next clip?
Okay, hold on, clip was here. It's Robocop, right?
Mm-hmm.
The good old.
close look at the track record of this company, and you'll see that we have gambled in markets traditionally regarded as non-profit. Hospitals, prisons, space exploration. I say good business is where you find it. As you know, we've entered into a contract with the city to run local law enforcement. But at Security Concepts, we believe an efficient police force is only part of the solution. No, we need something more. We need a 24-hour-a-day police officer. A cop who doesn't need to eat or sleep. A cop with superior firepower and the reflexes to use it. Fellow executives, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the future of law enforcement. Ed 209. The enforcement droid, Series 209, is a self-sufficient law enforcement robot. 209 is currently programmed for urban pacification, but that is only the beginning. After a successful tour of duty in old Detroit, we can expect 209 to become the hot military product for the next decade. Dr. McNamara.
We'll need an arrest subject.
Mr. Kenny. Yes, sir. Could you come up and give us a hand, please? Yes, sir. Mr. Kenny.
Okay, so for those who don't know the film, it doesn't go very well for Mr. Kenny, and the machine malfunctions. But the point that I'm sort of trying to make, and that is kind of what I'm trying to work on in the writing, is that there's something, there's a kind of interrelationship between the constant breaking of the fourth wall, which occurs in cartoons, and its constant sort of reiteration of the capabilities of its structure, but also the sort of cyclical way that these things are built, and the kind of material legibility of the fabrication in stop motion, is that the empathy relationship that's constructed is conspiratorial. And the success or failures of these things are through a sort of mutual acknowledgement of kind of either technical feats when it gets to stop motion, or a sort of imaginative aptitude that occurs in the earlier cartoon works. And as I say, it's not something that's really, I think it, after, well, kind of during the production of Jurassic Park, when stop motion gets kind of replaced by CGI, at least kind of for a while, though things as we saw the small impact department kind of reiterating that, and Tim Burton likes to use stop motion a lot, and these sorts of things. They're sort of still kind of quite marginalised technologies, and they're sort of CGI confluence, and I think the failings of a lot of those films would be through the intermingling of both CGI and the kind of tangibly fabricated elements. And maybe one of the successes of Anomalisa, which I think Michael mentioned before, is that you can see that it's kind of consistent in its single formality. So anyway, this kind of iteration of sort of a conspiratorial relationship, which I think is lost in CGI, is also kind of builds an affinity with the object of the sort of the animation, as it were, that kind of overruns a far more kind of black boxed and impenetrable relationship that most people have with modern technology, with CGI technology, for instance. And certainly it was the thing, so I was reading an interview recently with Joe Dante, and I just mentioned this, who's director of kind of Gremlins and the like, And the real issue that he had both with Gremlins and also later he was brought on to direct. There's a Looney Tunes movie called like Back in Action, I think, which is kind of terrible, but it sort of has some interesting bits in it. Made in 2008, was the hardest fights that he had, both on Gremlins in the 90s and Looney Tunes, was this breaking in the fourth wall. Again, it's just an anathema to the Hollywood system to have a non-cartoon subject, or even in Looney Tunes, a cartoon subject breaking the fourth wall. And I think that there's a sort of technical construction of empathy that occurs with stop motion or go motion, which is what Robocop is, that kind of overruns and kind of erodes that boundary a little bit. And my interest is very quickly in Robocop and this particular object, which is this enforcement droid 209, is through following different prop fabrication routes. You look to refabricate the stop motion puppet from Robocop. So if we go through the next couple of images. So this is the stop motion or go motion animation armature that was used to film the sequences you've just seen. The most difficult shots actually being the points at which ED209 gets close to the camera, which they had to take the camera apart in order to achieve because the proximity was too difficult. And next slide. This kind of like second by second manipulation, I think, is what registers in the same way that the kind of multiple iterations of the same circumstances in both strip cartoons and moving animated cartoons achieves, but it builds up a particular empathy with the technical achievement that's being evidenced in the film. If we go to the next slide. And something I've been following that I mentioned before is one particular forum where people refabricate film props. And there are certain relationships to screen props or hero props, so things like phasers or swords or whatever it might be, which are quite conventional and quite sort of straight-based, and there's very little conversation about them. But where something like ED209, so this is an archive photograph of the armature, the animation armature that's inside that little model of ED209. And somebody, sort of fans, who's learned SketchUp in order to build this model in 3D. And if we cycle through the next few slides, such that he could get, so he could understand the structure of it internally, and then how each of the joints might work. And then he's gone through a process, yeah, you can carry on. He's gone through a process where he started to fabricate each of the elements. And in order to do this, and he's not trained mechanic in any way, this is purely hobbyist. He's built himself a mission shop, but through the kind of forums sort of information sharing network that makes this possible. So he's unable to do something, and he asks people, they tell him, okay, you need to get this drill, this bench equipment, such that you can then start mapping out the parts that you need. This is the beginning of the foot that used to be in Robocraft here. Go on to the next slide. Okay, so it gets more sophisticated, and you actually need a different set of tools in order to route out the articulations of the Megtron. And then, so there were a number of kind of prop toys that were produced at the time, and this is the last slide, which to various people's eyes, if you analyze the film, the skin is sort of unsatisfactory of the toys. If we jump back to the last image. So rather than being able to use an existing kind of kit model that was available at the time, both it's not quite run to scale, and a lot of the articulations are slightly off. So this guy, if we go to the last slide, has kind of jerry-built a 3D printer in his garage in order to, and then also to learn how to use the software, all the texture mapping software that's then required in order to make the graphic 3D models, which he can then render with his 3D printer. He's kind of slowly building this equipment. And one of the kind of fascinating things is that there's this kind of, for me anyway, is that there's this sort of crowdsourcing sort of mutual encouragement also goes on that you can see a little bit in this image. And I think that's entirely materially related to the way in which the animation process works. Okay.
Brilliant.
Good time.
Mike, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, maybe a couple of quick questions. And one, I mean, I had two which maybe came to my mind. One is this motif of the conspiratorial, because early on, I'm not sure whether you still caught that bit of a conversation on it. We were trying to think about modes beyond the fully illusion-based, immersive cinematic space, and the, say, critical claims for criticality made around precisely the breaking of the fourth wall, the epic theater moment, you know, the Brechtian motif. We're trying to think about maybe the now as a moment where both of these forms are habituated and mixed up, you know, so when none of them really exists as a separate form of attention towards moving image any longer. Now, you seem to be suggesting two things, that on one hand this conspiratorial was available, but then is now being pushed aside in mainstream Hollywood as a taboo. Is that fair to say? That
I would say that for live action film, it was a no-no, and even films about cartoon making. So in 2008, Joe Dante was still having this problem with the studios, even though some of the characters, you know, it was Bugs Bunny, the characters. The idea that they would turn to camera and break the fourth wall was still a document that he was fighting. That was one of the biggest obstacles. I can't remember if I don't think in Roger Rabbit it occurred, which I guess is the previous kind of cartoon about cartoons. And I think for that it's a taboo still. I think less so now. There's a kind of knowing. There's an attempt to kind of re-articulate this kind of knowing relationship between the construct and how it is. You know, I think often like this, the water hitting the camera in Gravity, for instance, an example of this kind of, I think, sort of fundamental misunderstanding of how the digital effects are working.
So say that again.
Which I think was kind of formally consistent in a way that, from one of the pieces of reading, and I forget who was writing about Japanese animation in the 1950s, where he's talking about the graphic style containing, a logic that allowed for both kind of temporal and physical inconsistencies, such that you could see two sides of a boat, or you could see into a house, but you understood that you were looking through a roof rather than there not being a roof, which you also get, but it doesn't work so well. And I forget which. I think there's a Griffiths short, which is kind of the first to use this kind of cutaway, which then became familiar from Tuva or The Life Aquatic, say, where you have kind of cutaway walls, which are sort of coherent and easy to read. In a way, it kind of disappeared from live action filmmaking from the kind of 20s and 30s, when there are these kind of early iterations of, and it's something that Keaton plays around with quite a lot. Again, kind of beyond that point, I think it's so present, or kind of because it's not, it doesn't emphasize the consistency of an illusion.
How does that? I'm just trying to wrap my head around these. So that if on one hand, if you follow this logic, so on one hand, there's a prohibition against the character stepping out of character, as it were, the character breaking the fourth wall. At a moment when, at the same time, the technology speaking itself becomes fairly mainstream. So you have animation features that have outtakes, that have the behind-the-scenes making off with all the, the messed up lines, the corpsing that we know from feature extra material, which is then fabricated for animated movies, right? So this kind of self-speaking of the technology as a knowing gravity, and I'm thinking Gravity, the moment when it shifts from digital to analog filmmaking, the moment when she resurfaces back into Earth's atmosphere, which is shot on 35mm after all the rest beforehand being shot on digital. So again, there are a few moments in Gravity which speak to this acknowledgement, as it were. The tear that hits the camera lens. There's a few quite explicit references towards the a particular moment in filmmaking. You know, it's not necessarily a critical investigation, but it's an acknowledgement of the the technology of image making that speaks itself in this transition. It's caught out in the plots, of course, the resurfacing in the Earth's atmosphere as a different image texture and so forth. But I guess it's not even a question, but it seems interesting that there's a prohibition on one hand, whilst there's a mainstream acknowledgement, you know, which again unravels some of the certainties we used to have around what is a critical gaze, you know, what is a critical reading of a technology, of filmic narrative and so forth. That seems interesting. It's interesting that the prohibition holds for the character, you know, whilst everything else can declare itself quite explicitly.
Doesn't that have to
Yeah, but I think with sorry, there's somebody else speaking.
Yeah, Ramon is trying to.
No, I wanted to just interrupt the anchor. But that kind of breaking of the fourth wall happening in Gravity, or in I don't know, that seems to have to do with the desires to sort of have a feely effect on the audience of a 3D film, right? So it's a sort of calculated breaking of it. So I'm not sure that it's inadvertent. I think that it's an economical decision.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry. Could you clarify? Could you say it's I certainly wasn't suggesting in Gravity that it's accident. Of course, somebody's programmed that to happen. I just think in that instance, and in the context of that film, it feels just sort of a slightly handed showing up in a way that one understands it as a rendered environment and is aware of the sort of technical scene, and it seems to be a sort of true emphasis of that, which also is sort of not, it kind of breaks you out of kind of the emotional engagement in that moment if you have one, or if you find it too morbid, that's another thing. But it seems to serve no function that is kind of eternally critical in any way. But that's that example. I think that seems to be mishandled in that film. But it's certainly like the outtakes and some cartoons, I think that's true.
You can. I mean, in that moment, I remember the moment. I don't know if I saw Gravity with you actually, but I remember that moment where you felt the hand of some corporate CEO in the back room who said, "Come on, man, just let it hit the camera," you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Give me one of them. Just give me one.
Sorry.
I'm playing the part of the corporate CEO.
Okay. Yeah. But yeah, it seems to be a sort of, as I said, it's an unnecessary kind of showing off of what is kind of, you're already aware of the structuring of that relationship because you're wearing glasses. You don't start thinking about it.
I think you have to think about, in the context of genre cinema, the thriller, the horror film, and so on. Very often they don't use a fully disembodied camera, a kind of like omnipresent camera. There's a partial embodiment or some kind of like problematized movement. If you think about the cinematography in a film like Halloween, the camera goes from the serial killer to the victim and takes on a different kind of movement depending on who it's depicting. So the camera becomes a kind of mimic of its subject depending on the nature of the genre.
But made possible by the genre.
Exactly, made possible by the genre. So I think when you think about moments of recognition of the camera in a film like Gravity, you've got to think about it in terms of a suspense film premised on a notion of precarity, objects in space flying around. The camera becomes just another object moving through zero-G. You know, objects hitting objects, producing kind of radical kind of arrays of dangerous objects spewing out into the atmosphere.
Don't you think that Gravity is a new genre? It's a genre.
Yeah, it totally is.
It's a genre of this is what we can do.
Yeah, it's the genre. It's the big data genre. It's the genre of too many objects. The film is about the ability of contemporary VFX to simulate hundreds of thousands of objects in three-dimensional space. And in that sense, the camera, in the same sense that when you're in the software, the camera is an object that gets dragged from a menu into space, the camera in the film is an object in space like all other objects.
Yeah,
So
I don't think it's sort of fundamentally a film that is about the position of the camera in a way that whatever that terrible Matt Damon Mars movie was, has to kind of deal with the problem of what's recording it at any given moment. Or certainly it starts with a page in, and it's a problem it never solves and it's sort of abandoned. But it starts using the cameras that would be in that space. And I don't remember Gravity particularly ever kind of riffing on the fact that there would obviously be a sort of a feedback loop such that everything that they're doing is observed in a certain way. And I think that Mars film showed how kind of difficult it is to sustain that when you have a kind of a series of static cameras as a conceit.
Remember the film Leviathan?
Yeah.
That film Leviathan, it came out at the same time as Gravity, and I always saw them as the same film from really different. Because Leviathan was filmed, they initially brought like a regular camera and everything, but they jettisoned that when they realized that the GoPro was giving them effects that they never imagined they would get. So that film was actually produced. It wouldn't have been possible without GoPro. In the same way that Gravity. So that pitfall you're talking about, Mike, I think is what happens when the person who's supposed to be the maker is being made by the tools they're supposed to be using, right?
And in the case of Cuarón and those kind of directors, they're all still trying to deal with Kubrick. They're all still trying to deal with the highly ambiguous cinematographic language of Kubrick, where there's an intense authorship in one moment, and then a relinquishing of the camera in another moment. Shot to shot, a sense of claim over the camera in relation to the action changes. So if you think about 2001, one shot the camera is locked into the environment and is moving with it. In another shot, it's driving through the space, telling you what to look at. And I think there's a whole generation of directors who are attempting, like Christopher Nolan, attempting to take on Kubrick in that sense. And I think they fall foul of that because they don't understand the incredible ambiguity of his language.
Yeah, I think there is certainly I think there's an interesting moment where this is sort of off topic, but where the technology is caught up with kind of subjective cameras. They failed in the past, whereas Lady in the Lake, the company kind of fails to see something really work. I think there's a sequence in Rogue, Hitchcock's film, where there is a sort of a character plays a robot, effectively. You get this kind of first person embodiment. Same in Secret Beyond the Door, Fritz Lang. There was a kind of cluster around mid-40s, and then they dropped away. And I think, and also, I imagine that something like Strange Things was kind of too technically difficult and expensive to try and model for a camera that's much smaller than the camera they actually had to film with. And possibly now with something like Leviathan, the fact that you can kind of go over these things, then there will be a resurgence, particularly with 3D and also the kind of improvements in virtual reality. You'll get a lot more kind of first-person stuff, and you will kind of reason these problems. But it's also interesting that Kubrick destroyed all of his outtakes. He destroyed all the extra material. He filmed such that, at the beginning of DP, such that there could never be an outtakes reel of The Shining or 2001 or whatever. And there's only the scraps of the and the 3 documentaries that are made by his family. That's something.
Mike, thank you. Maybe we leave it there for now, if you don't mind, Mike. Hand over to Ramon.
Great.
For a slightly different take on the notion of infrastructure. Yes, so we'll keep you on Skype, but I'll take you off the screen, as it were.
Yeah.
And we'll try and get Ramon's material up. Ouch. Can you sound up? So this is Mike over there, Ramon in the middle, that thing over there. I don't need some. Okay, in which case let's do this. Do you need to do something? So, okay. This has all been very interesting, actually, and I didn't really. I think that the introduction of this will be useful, but I'm going to do something which is not going to. I'm not going to approach the idea of platform from any oblique angle at all. I'm just going to try to directly just give information of what platform is today in the context of discourse around infrastructures and by people like Benjamin Bratton, Keller Easterling, Bernard Stiegler, Yuqui, but also coming a lot from people like Simondon and Deleuze and Guattari, or Deleuze particularly in his post-control, Societies of Control text. So, sort of working definition of, well, first of all, just to say that someone like Bratton would position platforms as being on the same level as states and markets in terms of their share of control of power and sovereignty. So he gives this as a sort of basic definition: a standards-based technical economic system that simultaneously distributes interfaces through their remote coordination and centralizes their integrated control through that same coordination. So it's a sort of distribution and centralization simultaneously, which is, I guess, the novel bit. And then there's a bit of an etymology possible of, so first of all, platform comes from French, which would just be sort of a place that you stand, yeah? But in French, in terms of in film, you say plateau, that's the film set. So it's a sort of a platform in which characters might play out their roles. Right? But also a platform is a set of instructions in a scheme or a plan for action. And also around the very early 19th century, it becomes spoken of as a framework for political action, like the platform of a political party, right? So just to sort of bring in what a platform action really might be. I'm not sure that Microsoft Word is, or Microsoft Office is a platform, but Matt Fuller had this text in 2000, which he wrote about Microsoft Office. And it's a really funny text, where what he talks about is how the interface and the possibilities of Office, which are trying to be a sort of like a platform in which you can do anything kind of that you might want to do in an office, actually drives the user into an ideal state, and that ideal state is the Nigerian scan letter, right? Where because you all the templates, all the sort of the help guys or avatars that are trying to help you, they're all driving you towards this sort of this idea of a formalized of a formal letter, which actually turns out to be, and the ideal state of it is the Nigerian scam letter, where you sort of are able to sound semi-posh and really believable through the interface and sort of the canalization of Microsoft Word, right? And well, yeah, I think that's pretty good. All right, so I've tried to sort of put it all into 5 principles, which I've congealed from various sources. So the first principle of the platform is that there's no master plan, and that really differentiates it from other types of organization or planning or ways that try to channel or canalize people or things. So
is this, the platform has no master plan, yet it sets the stage for action, and the opposite of it is a bureaucracy. And an example of this, which is used in Keller Easterling's book, which she doesn't refer to this as platform, she calls it active form. But apparently in Savannah, Georgia, the Oglethorpe Plan, which was a sort of revolution in city planning, I know nothing about city planning, but in this kind of Oglethorpe Plan, the idea was all about ratios. So for every residential block that you wanted to build, you needed to ensure a certain amount of agricultural land and then a certain amount of green space. It was a sort of an algorithm of ratios, which was very successful and was picked up upon. So that's an example of a platform rather than a master plan. So if you think about the Parisian Haussmann-esque kind of master plan city where it's still there like it is now, the Savannah plan or the Oglethorpe plan was the opposite of that. And well, this is a rather big one. I've kind of crammed a lot into here, but the idea of generative entrenchment. So the idea here is that a platform basically captures users, human or non-human, into its constraints. But those constraints actually enable it to enable the users to well, a liberty of ends, right? So there's a sort of autocracy of means and a liberty of ends. So the platform contains standardized components that make it up, that make up what it is. So for example, you've got the green part and you've got those blocks. Those are standardized components. And yet within that constraint, you, as a user, have a sort of liberty of the ends. So the means are very autocratic. But the ends, well, you don't really know, right? The platform tries to allow the user to do what they want to do within those standardized components. And someone like Hugh Kui sort of this is going sort of out of the Bratton stuff, but another way of looking at it is mold versus modulated. So the sort of standardized components are molded, but the modulation happens at the level of the user, where the liberty of ends, so what you can do with these sort of standardized components, also modulates and changes who the user is, or what the user is for the system as a whole. It's kind of a complicated thing that we won't have time to get into. I'm only going to give it a 20-minute discussion. But the idea of generative entrenchment comes from a philosopher, and Alex Williams also talks about it. But it's a kind of very important part of the whole idea of a platform, in that it manages to capture users and entrench them into its sort of channels, but allows them a certain kind of freedom of use, yeah? So the third one is centralized and distributed. So a platform consolidates actors into alliances, right? So as a user on a platform, not human or non-human, you can group or be grouped with various different others into alliances. And at the same time, control and sovereign choke points are able to be distributed, maybe more, sometimes even wider than their users are. So the user never knows in what way they're being choked off or being opened up to different parts of the platform, enclaves or islands outside of it. A platform has a required provision of user identity. So, for example, for some people, for some users, that might be a really great thing, because otherwise they might be, if you think of users of Facebook or Google that might not be, that might be territorially sort of banished or exiled from the sort of global centers cosmopolitan culture like London, right? You would be able to transcend territorial exile and have an identity. So the provision of a user identity, you would be a user, something on Facebook. But at the same time, if you wanted to hide, if you wanted to sort of do bad things on Facebook, you also are a user. So the provision of user identity is a requirement of a platform. So it can either be really great, or it could be bothersome, or disagreeable, or something you try to avoid. And the fifth thing is the strategic. Yeah, I wanted to bring that in there again. So, so what the platform does, I'm going to come back to this ontogenetic metaphysics of becoming, the mold versus modulated, is that in terms of the user identity, what you are as a user, the sort of ontological substance of what a user might be, is no longer sort of molded in the sense that a nation state or even a market might accept the mold of a subjectivity. Rather, the platform, especially, and here I think we're speaking specifically about socio-technical network platforms, they perform a modulation, which is a kind of, going back to the Savannah example of a no master plan, it's a kind of an active form of subject production, which is continuously changing depending on which channels or turns you are making within the platform. When I say you, I think it could be anything, because of course we know that there are non-human users of platforms as well as human users. Strategic minimum of new content. So the platform structures value of content rather than producing it. Now what that means is that there's a kind of the idea of value. So the user, the platform needs to, systemically, the platform needs to strike a balance between the resources that they will spend to structure content and the value that that content brings from the user, right? So they want to sort of have a surplus user value and a surplus sort of systemic value. And an ideal platform is like an empty diagram through which users mediate new and archived information. Is that too fast? That was what I prepared, and here's some references. So I just sort of thought that would be, with the idea of platform, obviously I think can come into the conversation about animation.
What's interesting about platforms for me is that relationship between form and content. If you think about what Ailish was showing this morning, it appears to us as content, you know, like, oh, here's this piece of mail, or here's this kind of holiday offer, or something like that in augmented reality. But really what we're talking about is form, like a kind of schema through which everything gets passed and organised and turned into a particular type of experience. And I think for animation, like one of the most interesting things about animation, often when I've talked to people who are, you know, strongly critical of animation, they see it as juvenile and so on. Often it's a similar critique, this idea that you've got the complexity of reality with all of its socio-cultural, political complexity, and what gets filtered into the form of animation is highly exclusionary. Lots gets left out, lots of the richness, ambiguity, complexity of the world, and what we're left with is a kind of like a juvenile schema of things. And that's, for me, it's that question of like, what is if animation is a platform in the way that you described, what does it allow in and what does it keep out?
I'm actually thinking of platforms more as animators.
Right.
My concern isn't necessarily animation in the sense of making animation. I think that we can flip it around. You can look at platforms as being structures within which animation occurs. Right? And I mean, clearly that's the case with we were discussing game platforms, where they make games. It's very complicated to make games, so you can do it on a platform. But also platforms like Steam, I think, are platforms in that sense, where they animate activity within it. And users become sort of channelized or canalized. And the constraints, but I think that the conversation on the skeletons we had earlier, and the possibilities of what, how did you put it? The way that the animators became very self-aware of what their constraints were, and they pushed and went through it. I think that's very much a way that platforms operate. The idea of a sort of autocracy of means and a sort of liberty of ends is the ideal state of the platform. It's an animation itself, or cell animation itself, being a platform in that way.
Is it something towards the end around the ways in which subjects are constituted in reciprocity or exchange with these platforms? On one end, you have the free user, as it were, as one can see it, that feeds back to the machine. That this co-production of an unstable platform content that is mirrored in the unstable subjectivity that it co-produces, as well as harvests. And that seemed really interesting in this conversations earlier, but also yesterday, as to what happens to the spectator in view of the animated image. What happens to this spectator, I guess, we're all to some extent trying to understand the spectre of criticality, kind of what happens, what kind of gaze might be, kind of within the animated artifact or coming brought towards it. Where might such a thing as a critical reading take place, or critical disengagement and so forth?
I wanted to ask in that direction, because you brought in the question of critique or criticality. You mentioned two things a platform is not. So you mentioned bureaucracy as the opposite of a platform. You also mentioned that the content of a platform is not a platform. Could you think of other things that are clearly not a platform? Because as you described, the platform seems to be a pretty universal structure that keeps up with itself in a certain way, so also is self-contained and moved. It's a distributor, and it seems to be fairly oblivious to what it distributes, which poses the question, is content any concern of the platform? Or are there certain contents that can't be content of the platform, biomatter, for instance, or any kind of matter, or subjectivity?
That's one of the things that platform, the idea of platform, any kind of theorizing around platform or theory of platform will run up to is that the term platform can be used for many, many things. But I think that what most people who are looking at the platform right now are actually talking about are socio-technical platforms. And what Edgar was saying just now, which is the way that the platform seems to sort of have a sort of an active role in the modulation of subjectivity. It is to me also the interesting part of it is you enter into. I mean, there's the famous story of the target, the target woman who got a letter that she was pregnant before she knew she was pregnant, just because of the way that the platform had understood her questions on the internet, her searches. Right? So Similarly, the platform might identify you or produce a subjectivity of a female 8-year-old girl for a 40-year-old man. Those things are active and modulated within the platform, and they correspond to what Simondon, but through Stiegler and Dupuy now, are talking about the idea of individuation and disindividuation. So in this sense, it's a sort of what the ontogenetic metaphysics of becoming is the opposite of the mold. So the subjectivity is always something that is continuously changing. It is never finished, actually. So Simondon was looking at like machines and assemblage, and he was for him, it was the being of something was never static. It was never something that was given and that was stable. It was always something that was going to change, it was modulated, it was on the way to do something else.
And we have that in very real terms now with sort of metadata profiling. So are you saying that we animate, all of us animate ourselves in a way? All activity has this sort of ripple effect of animating us into a kind of subjectivity, a data set that stands in for us and is our interface with the platform.
Yeah, data structures. But I mean, yeah, the claim around platform, as far as someone like Bratton is concerned, is that it is the distribution of sovereignty away from state or market. It's so separate from, discrete from, differentiated from the state or from the market. So it's another, it's a third structure of power that goes across, that traverses both the state.
This idea of personhood, you've got the legal entity of the person, which has been the kind of, for at least 200 years, that's been the final definition of the person. And now we have this other personhood, this new layer, which is this data layer.
Which might not be a person.
Which might not be a person at all.
A person is like this Homo economicus, the sort of Foucauldian man. And then there's a sort of Westphalian state subject. And now the platform gives us a new idea of subjectivity, this sort of modulation version of the world.
Can I ask you another question concerning subjectivity? Also because you said that it redistributes or distributes sovereignty. So sovereignty has its state of exception or the excluded, the Zoe binus difference that Agamben elaborates on. Has a platform a state of exception? Or if you're talking about forms of subjectivity, does it have an unconscious? Is there something like a cellar, or as we were talking about before, where's the conspirational moment, or is there any conspirational moment in the platform?
I think it's a good question, because first of all, you have to sort of, there's several versions of what sovereignty is. Right? I mean, so the Schmittian sort of Agamben idea of sovereignty as being the state of exception, or the decision, the moment of decision. That's one. You also have the Rousseau, who's got a completely different idea of sovereignty. I don't have an answer to your question, but I'm finding the Rousseau. So Rousseau's idea of sovereignty, if you look at people like Eric Schmidt, or this kind of Silicon Valley discourse, the sovereign is very much the people, right? So the leader of the country, the president or the prime minister or the king, is not sovereign for Rousseau. The sovereign is another way of talking of the people. The people are sovereign. So the Rousseau idea of sovereignty is not the same as the Schmittian idea of sovereignty. But then someone like Ernst Jünger comes in and would say that the idea of this Rousseauian sovereignty is actually dangerous because it's sort of his idea that the people as sovereign means a total mobilization. So what kind of sovereignty is that play at the platform? I think it's different.
So you think the platform has no state of exception?
I don't know. Yeah,
or,
sure.
I don't know, failure, catastrophe, something that harms the platform from either outside or inside?
What these guys say is that the platform, built into the idea of platform is the notion that error and anomaly should be incorporated and embraced as much as possible by the platform. So the platform, in its systemic, so in its formal quality, as a set of algorithmic decision processes, will try to embrace the anomaly or the error and account for it in some way, in a reformatting of its shape and its form.
I think it's interesting to think through animation softwares in relation to this model, because it sensitizes us to the deterministic nature of the software. And the same is true of game softwares, that rather than having a kind of a tabula rasa that the digital gives us, we actually have a highly constrained model beyond the conventional the constraints of history determining what it is that you execute, a very real material set of constraints that the software will only do these things, and not just that it can only do these things, a la Photoshop, whatever, but in the case of things like Maya, or in the case of softwares like Nuke that we were talking about in Ailish's thing this morning, if you want that extra space, to use the sort of Rousseau model of the garden, if you want that extra bit of space to do something, there's a financial cost, a substantial, prohibitively expensive financial cost.
Plugin.
A plugin, exactly. So if you want Maya to go there, then all of the illusion of open source accessibility and so on, that all collapses, and you're confronting that very real, expense.
Yeah.
So the platform becomes very like a prism.
But I think to go back to the idea of Zoe, so Zoe, as mobilized by Gannon, is the idea of bare life, as opposed to the bios, which is a sort of political life or life possible within a city. In a way, yeah. So this game platform is actually a very good metaphor for this metaphor platform, because in a way, yes, there is a bare life operative on the platform. There is a life, kind of an existence, sort of, but it's not necessarily a BIOS. But yet, yeah, you can buy plugins in-app purchase.
And they rejuvenate it for a time, or rejuvenate it for a purpose.
Give you powers.
And give you power, which enables a kind of user differentiation.
The gamification of life in a way.
I mean, that's the interesting thing about animated bodies, in how they're deployed in contemporary technoculture as avatars, as sort of second selves, second lives, and so on, is that the avatar plus data, plus platforms and so on, it enables a fantasy hierarchy, fantasy differences that don't replicate this world, but imagine whole new hierarchies, whole new differentiations of subjectivity.
Yeah.
And that's when we get into this kind of, like the gamification of Chinese citizenship. We've heard about this recently.
Also, the specific urban citizenship is possible within China.
Yeah. So getting points for participation in culture and having that modelled in a virtual way,
Yeah. So I mean, very much so. So another part of the platform is the ability of the platform to block off or to open up areas to users, just like that. I mean, maybe China is the perfect, is a good example of the platform. Although China is today, it's a sort of centralized. When we think of China, we think of a central sovereignty, centralized classic sovereignty, actually. Whereas maybe it's not.
I mean, guess we've got two narratives now around. I mean, on one hand, I guess platform is very suggestive of a certain way of trying to think about the neoliberal, sort of deregulated forms of coercive regime components. But within that, it seems that there are two different, equally dystopian narratives. One is the infinitely malleable, coercive liberalness and flexibility of something that is resilient to catastrophe, precisely because it is fantastically adaptive. Right? So the idea that the anti-accelerationist argument around this phase of capitalism is beyond catastrophic meltdown because it is so recuperative of crisis as generative fuel. And that's one, in a way, self-fulfilling prophecy, by which the semi-organoid understanding of the platform is self-perpetuating. And the other one is the platform as a coercive, limited, it's addictive, but it's sort of, then you hit the real wall, of financial availability, of real world, criteria as to what is and isn't available and so forth. And China is interesting because it kind of, depending on what moment of the various cycles you talk to a Westerner about China, somewhat gleefully it's projected as either one or the other master narrative. This is the ultimate flexibility, the ultimate neoliberal, and then suddenly it's a draconian older version of sovereignty that pretends to be free market. Really, isn't it? It's interesting how something like the platform conjures or evokes both these narratives almost in one. It's a controlling mechanism as well as a perfidious emblem of eternal malleability.
Centralized and distributed.
Reminds me of Mike's fourth wall and the wall that Wiley Roadrunners putting up. Sometimes you go through it, sometimes it just knocks you back. It's there's a flexibility that can work autocratically, or it can open up to you.
That notion of sort of participation and transparency, I think, is what's interesting about this, and that is almost a metaphor of the Wile E. Coyote moment, is if we think in terms of tools, animation tools, for instance, and just computing generally, that idea of we have this new economy, this techno economy, and there's this kind of illusion that if we give every child an iPad, they're somehow participating in the new economy. This black box device that has no real ability to be manipulated at the level of computing. So long as we're operating with this device, we're participating in the economy. And that's the perfidious element you're talking about. It's like, you feel like you're using this thing. Wile E. Coyote feels like he's in control of the metaphysics of his reality because he has this apparent ability to render something, like draw the wall, but actually the Roadrunner has the full ability to participate in the capricious reality that they both occupy. The Roadrunner doesn't need to draw. The Roadrunner can run in and out of space, can use bridges that are apparently there or not there, and so on. And I think that narrative, that Roadrunner narrative, reflects something very fundamental about what you're talking about. It's the same if you take, for instance, the European Union. Jan Varoufakis is like, we need transparency. We need to be able to see what the EU is talking about to stop these secret meetings. And it's like, well, what gets shown for it, say they agree to that, there is this performance of transparency. Who's to say another meeting doesn't take place in which things are hashed out in secret? It's like, I think so much of platforms, in the way you describe, are about the performance of access, the performance of engagement.
And it's haunted by a promise of emancipation, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's a whole series of, Irid Rogoff included, attempts at rethinking infrastructure from the perspective of stakeholder, Michel Ferrer's notion of the participating democratic subject within a corporate and capitalist shareholder economy and so on. But of course, this is still propelled by a sense of emancipation. Once we are in it, we can handle it. And of course, the other aspect is that precisely you're in it whether you like it or not, but that doesn't grant you is a sense of emancipated agency. because no matter how much you think you're inventing yourself, when you code shape of the platform, you're automatically simultaneously harvested, as a co-producer of something that is beyond questions of agents and interference anyway. So this, and that seems to be a really complicated moment for well, in a way, and certainly over the last maybe 7 years, if not 10 or so, this idea of, I guess there was a moment of thinking around the possibilities of affirmative identification or over-identification, which is now Zizek, design of Clément Deleuze, and other such positions. How can you inhabit something? What does it allow you to do if you start inhabiting something against the odds and embracing it? And that seems to be much more disillusioned because that which is there to be inhabited is at least fantasized, if not diagnosed, as an organic monster. It's kind of way,
that's like the network, the rhizome moment, right? And now everyone's disillusioned because suddenly we realize, oh, we're platforming.
Yeah.
Could we, I don't know, there's lots of ways to take it. The platform thing obviously pertains to lots that's not to do with animation. Financial platforms, trading platforms, all the platforms we're using may or may not involve animation. So I just wanted to kind of think about that a bit more. So if we take out the strands of the conversation about art and productions earlier today, there was this claim for ambiguity to do with digital versus analog. Does the platform thing speak to that in the sense, just in terms of infrastructure of cinema production? Does it mean that animation has to be geared towards gaming platforms and therefore that kind of settles it in some way? Or is that one way to think about this in terms of more detailed cinema production?
Yeah,
I also wondered about that, so that's one thing maybe you can respond to. But I also wondered more generally about something around realism, which doesn't seem to have been mentioned today. Which, as the conversation's gone on, I'm kind of thinking, well, sort of rather down question, but what's our beginning assumption about what animation is, as distinct from so-called live action cinema? Okay, so lots of blurring during the day, but it seems to me one of the things that's interesting about the alignment of animation with, as it were, the infantile, is that there's a kind of anti-photographic realist impulse in animation. And in the break we were talking about the way in which, as it were, drawing gets suppressed in modernist art, arguably through minimalism and ready-made, but it sort of survives through animation. I think there's something really important about that for me. So when we're watching the, what's it called, Big Hero 6 image, in the background I'm kind of thinking, I'm not really sure whether those shells in the background are computer generated or derived from photographs of props. I couldn't tell, whereas the figures I think I can tell. So there's a point where kind of realism, in the sense of, in distinction from a photographic source in a traditional analog sense, that notion of realism presumably becomes important in the world of gaming. And at a point where, I don't know what that does to the notion of animation. Right, so there's a kind of demand in the platform for greater sort of whatever levels of resolution in terms of sort of commonsensical photographic notion of realism.
No Man's Sky, right?
Yeah. The argument that I've made sort of elsewhere is this idea that you have essentially a kind of Gombrich style sort of illusionist taxonomy of perceptual tropes, fur rendering, light execution, shadow, weight, volume, and so on, and that all of these games take these tropes and they structure and order them into a kind of gestalt, sort of total work of art, where you're in the world, things fall as you would expect them to fall, light passes on them, and so on. And what's interesting about that is that animation, in terms of the execution of movement, it just becomes another trope to kind of work in accordance with a sort of horizon of expectation that the tropes mutually set up. So when you're in the game world, each motif in the game world that makes up the overall gestalt is kind of setting expectations for everything else, and you end up with a kind of singularity of experience. And it becomes very hard to sort of single out animation from within that. It's in this kind of
coherence.
It's in a sort of singular coherence, absolutely. And that's the great problem with animation discourses as they move into games, is that you lose the animation object in the overall kind of schema.
Also, I mean, in terms of, I think games is the right place to take the conversation about animation. But first, just to your first point, I was actually turning around the thing. I wasn't thinking of animation in terms of cinematic animation. I was thinking, for a second, let's talk about animating beings within a sort of apparatus platform. But I mean, it's been like obviously games. So No Man's Sky is a game that's coming out soon, which has a procedural rendering, procedural engine, which means that it generates objects and worlds and universes as it goes. Therefore, there's no limit to the different types of creatures that might exist there, or the different types of wear. It's I mean, of course there are. It's exactly this. I mean, there are infrastructural components that remain the same necessarily, but there is a liberty of ends. And games will become, or are becoming, platforms within which people do much more than just play games.
I mean, all the major game producers, that's their explicit desire. It's so expensive, rather, to make a game that if you can create something in like a platform that is an entertainment experience. And World of Warcraft was the great kind of revelation for everybody working in games. If you can keep people in a thing for a decade, paying money to be there, and you don't have that initial overhead for a huge amount of time, it's incredible. I mean, from a purely capitalistic point of view, that ability to keep people paying a monthly subscription to participate in the world. I mean, No Man's Sky, no wonder Sony have gone absolutely bonkers about it. You know, this idea that you've just got this generative thing that it's kind of spews out this cornucopia of stuff based on an algorithm. You know, it's mind-boggling.
Then again, you have to also reconsider what you mean by a game. I mean, isn't Facebook a game? And isn't it animating? So I want to challenge. I mean, the limitation of the term animation right now to something that we're looking at on the screen.
I think there's that in relation to that, the idea of screens and touch and so on. If you take a painter like Laura Owen's recent work, where she's using swipe gestures as a kind of mark or signifier to be rendered in painting, saying this is important, we need to pay attention to this thing we do every single day, this kind of hieroglyphic-like thing we do on this screen, you know. That's like an expanded field of animation where we think in terms of those things as capturings of animation. I think there are lots of artists today who are thinking about those micro animations that are sort of everywhere.
And I mean, but I think that also that thing about, I mean, how the touch screen sort of operationalizes us to complete its circuits, and as a sort of, I think once you start to think of this adamant surface in his mind, sort of liquid crystals fascination, and there's the liquid crystals in us, and liquid crystals in it, and you get all sorts of reflections back and forth. But I think more and more we're, in a sense, the ones being used or deployed or being the platform for it or something, making
making up the circuits through us or launching activities through our sort of capacitors as well as our desires. So I do think it gets really interesting once you start thinking about these intimate kind of objects and how they animate us, but we animate them, we exist to animate.
That relates to W.J.T. Mitchell, doesn't it? Like, what does it want of us? Also that Richard Serra idea of television delivers people, you know, this reversal where, you know, as you say, harvests.
And I guess part of one of the initial starting points for this overall conversation, you know, when we first started thinking about this idea, Anselm Franke was in the old animism strand, you know, and part of it had to do with animated technologies and techniques, but another one was really, I think, a much broader question around what I think a lot of us perceive as a somewhat unclear redistribution between the animate and the inanimate, you know, which have now come back, I think, interestingly over the last couple of days in terms of figure-ground relationships. Luckily, we've gotten away from notions of representation, image, reality. None of that seems to capture any of the conversations we had, which is useful. You know, but it's also useful to log that. It's no longer useful that particular paradigm for these interactions. You know, but to really then think where this takes place. You know, partially the animation of these objects. You know, this moment when you have to read a number of letters and numbers, a sequence of numbers and letters to identify yourself as a non-artificial entity. As you subscribe to a website, you know, you have to prove to the computer that you're not one of them. You know, and there are these inversions and these redistributions, and whilst on one hand they have to do with the potential for action of images and how we co-produce these realities, the other redistribution, I think, in the background of this is a really fundamental confusion around the status of materialities. You know, what constitutes a material reality? You know, how do you even start capturing that? We haven't quite got the vocabulary for it yet, but you know, at least we know we have got it anymore. And those redistributions, I think, all, to my mind at least, speak to this question of animation. You know, as a procedure, as conditions, as a demand, you know, as a systemic demand as well as an individual aspiration, possibly. You know, it's interesting that in a way, I mean, I'm also thinking back to Donovan yesterday, like thinking about the way how labor then is factored back in these replica, retro engineering feasts that set up entire industrial cottage industries for the remake of something that in itself was as jerky and clumsy as that, but then was processed and transmutated through a Hollywood machine that pretended gravitas foray, but it never had any original making. I was very interested, Mike, if you can hear me. You talk about this somewhat clunky animation of the ED209 and how difficult it was to animate that, and how in a way that was both accentuated and compensated for by the soundtrack. You know, the sound was really palpable in the boardroom, and suddenly this clunkiness, both the accentuation of the artificiality of this machine, that it doesn't really work quite properly, you know, as well as giving a really very recognizable Gestalt, a sound Gestalt, you know, to that android robot threat that suddenly emerges in the boardroom protocol.
There's an interesting artist, Zach Glass, who works precisely, who does animations, but other things too, and who really works on that, precisely that. Often, not always, I suppose, touch, identity, whatever identities were animated, proving organizable themselves. And then also, again, I can come up with a reference to Asia, that, like, the whole question of subject and subject-object came to Japan. It's still very, very new, so that also the subject
I think if you think about Satoshi Kon's films, like Perfect Blue, Millennium Actress, and Paprika, big Japanese anime feature films, they all deal with that kind of sort of specifically kind of Japanese relationship to an online persona, an offline persona, celebrity on the one hand, and ordinary everyday life on the other hand. And what's so interesting about those films, Satoshi Kon's films, is you watch them and on the one hand you think these could be live action films, but then you realise at a fundamental level they absolutely could not be live action films. His execution of animation enables him to get much deeper with that subject matter.
It's also maybe to think about a little bit her genre and a particular moment in political cinema in Japan, the landscape film, Keiran and the theory of landscape, which there was no person in the film, but it was the most political film in that sense. So again, to open up the question of the sovereignty and people, maybe that would be interesting to look into in relation to that. So diagrammatic inventorism, supporting in some sense, also related then to Strawberry's film, to early Juliet. It's the landscape, the plateau, and there's Tom Conley as well who talks about the stratigraphic cinema, so about the geological formations and so we talk a lot about today about also human time, but there are other times, abstract time, geological time, or other personal times. So, yeah.
I think that's a crucial thing to do with animation's ability to give us access to different sort of less anthropocentric sort of views on time and space and so on.
And that's maybe something that, if we talk about something that the present animation, whatever that means, the animation of the present does, is maybe hopefully precisely that.
Yeah.
To somehow open that up.
Yeah. It's almost, with Jean Gérard, you almost get a sense of like deep time, that opening up of time, where when you watch a movement, the implication is that you're not just watching one movement, you're watching a repetition over massive time, perhaps, you know, or this. There's a strange temporality that isn't reducible just to the kind of simple notion of the slowness of his shots. There's a sense of density. It's kind of like.
But also the idea of a general ecology where you're within that already. So it's not you're talking or you're watching, you're within that.
Yeah.
This is
and it's sensitizing you to
confusing
that.
and kind of strange situation, and that really also kind of maybe catches something of Simon Wolf's idea of individuation.
Yeah.
This embeddedness.
And then it's striking in this context that we haven't really paid much attention, and I guess deliberately, to viewing conditions in this. You know, you said that at the very beginning, yes, the screening of these were, to some extent, rather nonchalantly grab bits and pieces of flotsam, you know, that we animated as a semi-intelligible chronology or something. But of course that, I think, then comes back into the frame now, if indeed animation is also a promise, you know, it's also a part of a post-human set of possibilities, of enacting a different form of ecology, a different subject, background, distribution can be enacted and performed by something like animation. I think it might be useful to then really think back about viewing constellations. Maybe could also expand that then to to some extent prompted by the Pierre Week material yesterday. You know, what the outlines of an experiential being animated they are. You know, is it bound to a certain art experience? What does that mean? Is it necessarily bound to moving image? You know, like going back into Nicolas Bourgeois' notion of the exhibition as a movie without a camera. You know, or Andy Warhol's life inside the silver screen. You know, the idea of the animate moving image as a condition. You know, as a given backdrop against which one performs. I mean, those more, I guess they're more ontological declarations than actually necessarily technological propositions.
And that relates to the otaku as well, seeing life as animation.
I was reading yesterday, have you come to some kind of definition of what animation is? Or is that something desirable? Or because animation could be just all of
It
that.
might be unlimited.
Is someone playing a video game somewhere in the background?
Mike?
Yeah,
Mike, are you digging for World of Warcraft Gold?
I'm not reading for any Warcraft novels.
I mean, there's contingencies also in World of Warcraft. I find it, I mean, I've never been on it, in it, with it, but the fact that Aikido operatives find it very useful at a moment when all kinds of other platforms became more transparent. You know, including the obvious narrative by which you have Aikido operatives hiding out in the cabin in World of Warcraft. You know, it's a bit like a summer Milan from the cave from Lord Kalashnikov. But I think one of the questions forward, it would seem to me, and we can run this into the next session, maybe need a break now, but would be precisely this: what the horizon of something like this as research generative might be. You know, is it to arrive at a consensus? Is it to, I mean, my instinct would be the opposite, would be to take very granular textures and competencies very seriously and see what they're productive of. You know, and then also how they speak to each other and how they're distributed.
Yeah.
But maybe, should we just take a 10-minute break or so, grab a coffee, and then come back for, I don't know what for some maybe
kind of wrap
stock
up
take.
and, yeah.
You know, I just wanted to sort of mention that initially, if I had time, I had the idea to, because you had the idea of the glossary, which you said was the framing device. Obviously, a glossary is a kind of platform, right?
Mm-hmm.
And an encyclopedia or a dictionary or a grammatical textbook, even more so, I think, than the drives. So I thought, of course, the best thing to do would be to find the entry for of platform in the Encyclopedia Encephalo, or to invent one.
Can I throw something in as well?
By all means, you're a bit, hold on, I've plugged you out of the speakers, so I'll just go for it.
It was also a question maybe for like kind of thinking about picture debate. It came up as we were talking about the question of like subject specificity. Like there's a degree to which, say, stop motion animation confines itself to the animation of particular kinds of bodies. So often things that are non-human. So be it Harryhausen's skeletons or the mechanistic things that lend themselves to a degree of unknown locomotion. Say dinosaurs also kind of apply to this. Like it's unpicked subjects that it can kind of work with coherently because it could invent the model of how these things were to move. And I wonder whether the kind of this, even just like the kind of thinking about things through animation terminologies has like a subject field that it's relevant. Some things are accessible to it, some things are kind of excluded from considering in that way, and be it through it being a sort of logic of instantaneity, if it's kind of breaking frames, things like this, or whatever it might be. Different types of animations seem to aggregate around different types of subject. Sorry, it's a thought, not a question.
But it's, I mean, like, it's interesting how then, in a way, it goes, I mean, it's the production of locomotion rather than the imaging of locomotion, right? Or the conjuring of the old. And in a way, it does bring us back to the vaudeville and the magical as another paradigm for this, much more than the analytical, possibly.
I think you also deal with animation in that moment as a popular art that is concerned with maintaining a continuous vernacular. you know, that it understands that its audience has some conception of what animation is, and also has a conception of what animation is in its specific manifestations as stop motion, CG, 2D and so on, and is looking for those vernacular languages to be carried forward, or if they are going to be altered or changed or added to or whatever, that has to be kind of worked through in the text.
But I'd say that also that I think maybe this is my problem also with CGI is that something that I was trying to talk about was that there's both a sort of inaccessibility and the lack of a sort of consistent kind of formal usage of it that I kind of think acts as a sort of distancing from that. So like the logic of cartoons, you understand how they work. There's a sort of affinity that's kind of built up with that, whereas CGI always has the problem that it's, or often, if it's not like in a sort of cartoon universe, it's always competing against that proximity to the natural world. And that's where it sort of falls down in a way that, say, scenic painting or map painting of fantastical environments in the Wizard of Oz, say, never had to compete with that, as long as they stay coherent to that universe. Whereas if a person who's animated walks badly, somebody walking on the deck of the Titanic looks like they're not, that their locomotion is unnatural. The eye registers it, and that's its competition. There's no kind of affinity there that is built up through what you're saying, this kind of the conventionality.
Great.